Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course, Introduction to Cultural Studies. What we'll do today in this lecture, we'll start with an essay by George Orwell called Shooting an Elephant. This is an essay about something which really happened when he was a colonial officer in Burma. And we'll read the essay in details in this lecture and in the next lecture as well. We'll take 2 lectures to finish this essay. And the reason why we have selected this essay is because it's a really interesting work. If we need to examine the idea of identities. We've spent a lot of time talking about the production of identities, hegemonic identities, complicit identities, subordinate identities. And identities become really important in politically unequal situations where we have, for instance, colonialism, when we have one race or one culture dominating another culture. Then we have the idea of hegemonic identity, idea of dominant identities, which are of course politically produced, discursively, disputed and disseminated and consumed, right? So the whole idea of power becomes very important, and we've already read Said, Edward Said, and then Homi Bhabha, and we've seen how power becomes a really important tool, a really important instrument, a really important factor in terms of the production of identities in the colonial space. And if you remember Bhabha's essay, which we covered in the last lecture, The Other Question, which is the name of the essay, they spent a good deal of time talking about the idea of metonymy and metaphor, and how metaphor and narcissism are related, and how metonymy and aggressivity are related. So this 4-term strategy that we talked about, very, very interestingly, I think Bhabha offers that strategy, offers that model of looking at identities, this model which can be used very gainfully, I think, in terms of looking and examining identities, especially in colonial conditions. Now, what this particular essay is very useful for, Shooting an Elephant, is it's an essay about what really happened in a particular situation in a colonial space. So this is an essay written by George Orwell when he was an officer, a colonial officer, a police officer in Burma, about an experience that he went through. And the whole essay really offers a very interesting glimpse into the idea of identity. So, it really cracks up the constructed quality of identity. So we spent a good deal of time already talking about how, ideology, identity, culture, these are largely constructed categories. These are constructed to economy processes, political processes, discursive processes. So what this particular essay does very poignantly, I think, is it completely cracks up, opens up the constructed quality of hegemony, hegemonic identity, power, and the entire powerful presence in the colonial space. And it's a really interesting essay also because it's a very politically incorrect essay. There are certain elements, certain components, certain sections of the essay which would now be considered as racist. If we use modern standards, modern measuring words, rods, then we find certain sections are profoundly racist, certain sections are profoundly problematic. If someone were to write this essay now, there'd be certain sections which would be omitted, which would be done away with, etc. But this is why we find this essay so useful in culture studies, because of its political incorrectness. Because political correctness as a term, as a category, is very contingent on the conditions of the time. So what is politically correct today might become politically incorrect tomorrow, and vice versa, right? So the political correctness as a construct in this particular essay doesn't really work well. It's a politically incorrect essay. It's an essay about ambivalence. It's an essay about confusion. It's an essay about cynicism. It's a very cynical, dark, ambivalent, sort of helpless take on futile take on imperialism. So we have someone, the Orwell persona in this essay, who hates imperialism, who hates the job he's doing as an imperial officer, but equally, interestingly, he hates the Burmese people because they hate him. And so the different kinds of hatred which are operative in this particular essay. And those of you who are aware of George Orwell would know he was a Marxist philosopher, a writer, a literary writer, wrote some of the most monumental works of fiction in 20th century, including, but not limited to Animal Farm, which is a magnificent allegory of Stalinism, 1984, which is a profound dystopian fiction about a world where everyone's watching everyone else. And also, less famously a novel called Burmese Days, which I think is a really magnificent work, because Burmese Days is a novel about colonial experiences in Burma, and Orwell evidently draws on his experiences as a colonial officer. He was stationed there for some time, and his life is very important. He was born in modern Bihar, actually, a place called Motihari in Bihar, where he was born, and then he went off to England, where he did his schooling. He went to a public school, and then he came back to India, Imperial India, as a colonial officer. So his relationship with imperialism is very complex and very interesting, right? So he gives you an insider's view, an insider's take on imperialism. It's a critique of imperialism, this particular essay, but equally it's a commentary on the confusion that imperialism creates, the cynicism that imperialism creates, and also the kind of existential exhaustion that imperialism creates as well. I mean, there's a degree of exhaustion in the essay which is really existential. I mean, he finds himself completely hollowed out as a person, right? Because what happens in this essay, as we'll see when we read it, is he becomes the Orwell persona in the essay. He becomes an imperial machine, a machine who is supposed and expected to carry out, perform certain imperial duties, certain imperial responsibilities, which often come at a cost of the human will, the human agency. So the question of agency becomes very important in the essay, because agency can be defined. I think we've already spoken about agency to a certain extent. It can be defined as the will of the person, the will of the individual, and the ability to carry out that will, with the possibility of bringing about a change. Now, whether the change will happen or not is a different question. But agency is a possibility, the will and the possibility of bringing about change by exerting, by enacting that will. Now, what we find in this particular essay, Shooting an Elephant, is an allegory of the death of agency, the annihilation of agency over here, because the human will and the imperial will are at odds with each other over here, right? And so it becomes a really, really interesting text for cultural studies, because it shows you that culture as a construct can become hegemonic. Culture as a construct can become tyrannical, really. It can consume human will, it can consume human agency, and then it can become some kind of a sort of a cannibalistic construct which consumes away the pure human volition, pure human will, pure human desire, and free choice, right? So, over here, culture becomes a really an overarching tyrannical kind of a construct, and Orwell, the human being, finds himself consumed increasingly by that construct. So, this is the background of the essay, the discursive background, which I've sort of mapped out for you. Now, if you read the essay, which we will in a minute, we find out how this particular essay reveals that all the idea about identity, we talk about hegemony, we talk about political presence, political privilege that we talk about. So how these are really constructed categories which can be deconstructed in certain situations, right? And how these categories, these constructed categories, can actually become so powerful, so hegemony, that they can take over the human will, they can take over the human emotion, they can take over the human agency, right? So that becomes a really, powerful, the powerful man over here becomes powerless. Precisely because he has to be powerful all the time. So that's the profound paradox of the essay, that you're powerless only because you have to be powerful all the time, because that's your hegemonic identity as a white man in a colonial space, that you don't have the choice of not being powerful. You don't have the choice of not carrying out the powerful man's job. It's your job, it's your responsibility, it's your expectation of you that you perform power all the time. And if you stop to perform power, then you crash the whole system. Then you basically compromise the whole colonial system. Okay, so this is a question. This is an essay on ambivalence, confusion, cynicism, and agency, and how all these things, all these categories, all these effects are tied to the cultural question, the cultural identity question. Okay, so it becomes a really important text for us who are interested in cultural studies. So let's take a look at what happens in Shooting an Elephant. It should be on your screen, and I'm going to read out the essay in some details, because I think it's a very short essay, and I think it needs to be read in details in order to sort of grasp the full phenomenon of what really happens, or what really transpires in this situation. So this is George Orwell talking about his experiences in Burma, and about a certain situation, a certain event, which really opened up the constructed quality of power, the tyranny of power, and how the powerful person is consumed by the power that he or she is expected to enact. Right, so this is the essay. In Molmen, in Lower Burma, I was hated by a large numbers of people. The only time in my life that I have been important enough for this to happen to me. So, the very opening sentence of the essay, it has a degree of dark humor quality, right? So he's saying that I was hated by lots of people, and that was the only time in my life I was important enough to be hated, right? So there's a degree of a paradox there. You're hated because you're important. Importance is good, but hatred is bad. So how, immediately you are in the heart of ambivalence in the essay. The very first sentence it sort of drives you into the heart of ambivalence. I was subdivisional police officer of the town, and in an aimless, petty kind of way, anti-European feeling was very bitter. No one had the guts to raise a riot, but if a European woman went through the bazaars alone, somebody would probably spit beetle juice over her dress. As a police officer, I was an obvious target and was baited whenever it seemed safe to do so. When a nimble Burman tripped me up on a football field, and the referee, another Burman, looked the other way, the crowd yelled with hideous laughter. This happened more than once. In the end, the sneering yellow faces of young men that met me everywhere, the insults hooted after me when I was at a safe distance, got badly on my nerves. The young Buddhist priests were the worst of all. There were several thousands of them in the town, and none of them seemed to have anything to do except stand on street corners and jeer at Europeans. So what's interesting is the claustrophobia of the condition. It's a very claustrophobic condition where everyone hates them, and he can feel the hatred, he can feel the aversion, the collective aversion that he's subjected to just because he happens to be a white colonial officer in that particular town. So again, look at the way in how power becomes paradoxically what consumes it, because power produces privilege, yes, but it also produces hatred, especially in unequal situations where one particular race, one particular system, one particular culture is dominating, exploiting another culture, where Orwell, the person over here, becomes an instrument in the power machinery, and by dint of that he becomes a subject of hatred, the object of hatred for all the Burmese people who feel that he is a representative of imperialism. So interestingly, if you read the opening section, he says that the kind of hatred he's talking about is very, very petty, very aimless. It doesn't really transform into rebellion. It doesn't really transform into a collective subversion, but it operates in very little petty ways, which actually gets on his nerves. Right? So getting on his nerves is making him really more and more sort of nervous, more and more hysteric in certain situations. And he gives an example of how he would be insulted spectacularly in a football field where, if he's playing a football game with his other officers, the Burman officers, Burmans would often trip him, tackle him unfairly, and the referee, who would be another Burman, would just ignore it, and a crowd would come together. The match would sort of break out in hideous laughter. Right? Now, obviously, the interesting thing about this section is notice how the site of subversion over here is a football field, where there's a game going on and the white man can be beaten up safely, because the worst that can happen to you if you beat a white man in a football field is you get a red card. Right? You don't get a political penalty, you get a sports penalty, right? And that's easier to handle. But that becomes the site of subversion, that becomes a safe site of subversion. And not just safe, spectacular, because you can actually beat a white man in a football field in the presence of thousands of people, and you get away with just a red card. So the space becomes very important over here. And also, this is interesting because we in cultural studies are very interested in space, because remember, space is also very discursive, space is also very ideological, right? Space is not apolitical at all, especially in colonial conditions. So the football field becomes a very discursive political space, because that's a space where you can actually beat a white man and get away with just a red card. That's a space where all you can do, all that can happen to you for beating a white man is getting a sports penalty. You penalize with the grammar of sports and not with the grammar of politics, right? So it becomes a very important, a very interesting little episode. And then, he says that he's hated by everyone. Wherever he goes, people hate him, and anti-European feeling works in a very petty way. People spit beetle juices on European women's dresses and run away. So everything around is very claustrophobic, everything around is very unhealthy, very neurotic, and that obviously is an epiphenomenon, a product of imperialism, where obviously the Burmans feel persecuted by the Europeans, the Burmans feel exploited by the Europeans, because the European presence in Burma is an exploitative presence. It persecutes the Burmans, it takes away the wealth, it takes away the resources, and subjects them to a marginalized presence in their own space. So obviously the retaliation from the Burmese side is a very petty, aimless kind of retaliation. But despite the pettiness, despite the fact that it doesn't really transform into a narrative of rebellion, it works in very micro, aimless, petty ways. But this micro, aimless, petty acts of rebellion collectively really sort of influence Orwell, in a level of nerves. It really gets badly on his nerves, he says. And then he talks about the Buddhist priests who stand and jeer at him, mock him on street corners. Again, it's not something that you can do really legally. When someone jeers at you, when someone mocks you, when someone ridicules you facially using gestures in the street, I mean, there's nothing you can do except ignore it. But then, if you're using political power, if you're using political privilege to tackle that, to handle that, then you're becoming insecure, right? So you tend to ignore it, but then you can't ignore it all the time because it's happening all the time. In every street corner, there's a Buddhist priest, according to Orwell's description, jeering him, mocking him, right? Jeering at him. Right, so that becomes, so in the very opening paragraph of the essay describes the claustrophobia, the neurotic sort of degree, the neurotic quality of colonialism, where the Europeans are hated, the Europeans hate the Burmese hate the Europeans. It's a very unhealthy human existence that has been talked about, and this unhealthy bit, is an interesting bit for us in culture studies because there are two ways, sort of stereotypically, in which imperialism is described by contemporary writers, by writers who are actually sort of dealing with imperialism, were present during imperialism, especially Indian imperialism. One way was to glamorize it, to look at it as a civilizing mission, a benevolent mission, as a European enterprise, a European glory narrative, heroism narrative, where the dominant narrative is we came and rescued the Indians, we came and rescued the natives, didn't have any culture, didn't have any religion, didn't have any language, we gave them all that. That's one narrative. The other narrative is like, this is a very terrible thing, and it happened, and we're very sorry for that, etc. So, but Orwell over here seems to be somewhere in between. So he doesn't take the stance of Kipling. I mean, for Kipling, imperialism was a white man's burden, as you know. It was a civilizing mission. So white man would come, and it was a responsibility, the burden of the white man, to sort of cure the native, to redeem the native in a way, to give the native civilization, language, religion, culture, and all of that, which presumably did not exist, according to Kipling, before the Europeans came. That's one dominant narrative. So Orwell takes a sort of a very cynical stance. He's obviously very far from the Kipling-esque narrative of imperialism, but at the same time, despite his sympathies for the natives, he hates the natives, right? So he's somewhere stuck between the two, and this degree, this quality of being stuck between the two is something that we find very, very attractive, very interesting in this particular essay. And that is the position from which he produces the politically incorrect narrative about imperialism, right? So, and this is very politically incorrect because on one hand, he confesses, very soon we'll see that imperialism is a terrible thing, it's an evil thing, it's about exploiting people. But on the other hand, he also confesses that he hates the Burmese people. So it's not as if he's being politically correct and saying that, oh, I'm all for the Burmese and I love the Burmese and I hang out with them, I really like them. He doesn't say that. He says, I'm ideologically for the Burmese, secretly, of course, because I'm working for the empire at the same time. But at the same time, it's also true that I hate the Burmese. So he's someone who is living a very hollow, hypocritical existence. Okay, and we'll see that in a bit. So the next paragraph sort of really elaborates on this complex claustrophobia. And he says, and I quote, all this was perplexing and upsetting. For at that time, I had already made up my mind that imperialism was an evil thing, and the sooner I chucked up my job and got out of it, the better. Theoretically and secretly, of course, I was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British. So, listen, I mean, sort of see the way in which he juxtaposes the words theoretically and secretly. I mean, in theory, in ideology, he knows imperialism is a terrible thing and he's all for the Burmese cause. However, all that lovely stance, all the political stance he's taking is a secret stance because at the end of the day, he is an officer who's getting paid, who's on a payroll of the empire. Right, so he cannot really go up and say publicly that he hates imperialism because it's getting paid for it. It's getting paid for his job as an agent of the empire. Right, so he's somewhere, stuck in a very hollow, hypocritical position, and this hypocrisy, this hollowness, inform the cynicism that that goes into the essay. The cynicism which makes a profound text, really, I think, for cultural studies students like ourselves. Okay, so he was all for the Burmese and all against the oppressors, the British. As for the job I was doing, I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of the empire at close quarters. The wretched prisoners huddling in the stinking cages of the lockups, the grey, cowed faces of the long-term convicts, the scarred buttocks of the men who had been flogged with bamboos, all these oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt. But I could get nothing into perspective. So, this is a very interesting glimpse, a very interesting reflection of imperialism, because I just mentioned that there are two ways of looking at imperialism from a British perspective. You take up heroic, glorified long shot, like Kipling, and sort of say that this is a grand mission. You're looking at it from a perspective, a very noble, broad, magnificent, panoramic perspective, where imperialism becomes a white man's burden, a civilizing mission, really a macro narrative of rescuing and redeeming, etc. Or you take a completely opposite stance, where you say that this is a terrible thing, etc., and we should not be doing it, and so let's get out of it, etc. But then Orwell, he hates imperialism. He says this is a dirty job, but then he can't get out of it either because he's getting paid for it. So, despite all the political all the political consciousness that he has, he ends up doing the job just as much as anyone else does. And also look at the way in which the images come. So the dirty work of the empire. So he sees the prisoners beaten up, he sees the prisoners tortured in prisons in terrible human conditions, and he knows very soon, very quickly, he realizes that there's nothing glorious about imperialism, there's nothing heroic about imperialism. It's a dirty job of exploitation, it's a dirty job of torture, really. And the sooner it gets out of it, the better it is, right? So, it's a very unromantic, unheroic look at imperialism, and this is exactly why we look at this particular essay as a really interesting text for cultural studies, because it really is a really interesting and rich commentary on the culture of imperialism at the time, a very unheroic, cynical, dark look at the culture of imperialism. So all these images of prisoners sitting huddled up in stinking cages, beaten up, flogged by bamboo sticks, it gives a really unpleasant, terrible, inhuman idea of imperialism, which it really was in the first place. So, and Orwell is giving you an insider's perspective of imperialism. So he's giving you the perspective of a conscientious white imperialist who, despite being conscientious, is hypocritical and hollow because it doesn't really take up a stance. He hates imperialism secretly, but that's all that is. It's a secret hatred. He doesn't have the courage to publicly own it up, confess it, or do something about it. He's just writing an essay. It's more of a diary writing, if we notice it. It's not something that seems to be for the consumption of everyone. It comes across the diary writing, it's meant for someone who is, who's a British person living in England, someone who's sort of relayed the tales of horror from an insider's perspective into imperialism. So, and this is exactly what makes it so politically complex. The incorrectness of the essay makes it complex, and this is something that we should be aware of. So, all these images of imperialism, people being tortured and exploited and imprisoned and beaten up, all these oppressed me, Orwell says, with an intolerable sense of guilt. But I could get nothing into perspective. I was young and ill-educated, and I had to think of my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. I did not even know that the British Empire is dying. Still less did I know that it's a great deal better than the younger empires that are going to supplant it. All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who try to make my job impossible. Notice the really interesting vacillation between ideological correctness, ideological sort of conscientiousness, and a very racist rhetoric. Right, so he's saying that I was young and ill-educated, I was confused, I was callow, and I did not know what I was doing. I was just doing my job, but I was getting increasingly guilty and increasingly uneasy with what I was doing, with what I was a part of, a party to, etc. And he's saying equally that I had to think of my problems on my own, and there was no one that I could speak to. So he gives a very interesting picture of alienation. So the agent of the empire is increasingly and essentially alienated in the empire. He's sort of cut off from the empire, cut off from everything. You cannot confess what's exactly going on in your mind because you have to perform the social codes, you have to perform the colonial codes the cultural codes of colonialism in order to enact the machinery of colonialism. So this is the image that is very interesting, the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. And then he comes to say that I don't even know that the British Empire is dying, because he was right in the heart of it. And if you're in the heart of something, you don't quite know whether that's decaying or not, because you're still a part of it. And it takes a sort of a longish perspective, a longer perspective, a sort of more far-off perspective to understand what's really happening to imperialism. And so this is 1936, the beginning of the end of the empire, as you could say, because the empire, especially in India, ended in 1947. So a decade before it all ended. So he did not quite know at that point in time that it was ending, because he was right in the middle of it, and he did not have any idea of his imminent end. And then he says that, and I didn't even know that this British Empire was a great deal better than the other younger empires that were going to supplant it, right? So he's talking about the American Empire, the rise of America as a superpower, the rise of the USSR as a superpower, and he sort of says at the moment that those were much worse than the British Empire at that point in time. So the quality of the essay, the tone of the essay is interesting. It's a retroactive narration, a retrospective narration, right? It's a much older Orwell retrospecting about something that happened to him when he was much younger. So it's a much older, much more experienced voice reflecting on something that happened to the person when he was much younger, right? So a more matured voice talking about a less matured self. It's a very common strategy in literature. You can think of something like Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, which does a similar strategy at the narrative level, that we talks about what the story that we hear is a much older Pip talking about what happened to a much younger Pip. So the tone of the voice is very mature. The tone of the voice is more mature than the protagonist, the content of the story. The protagonist in the story is less mature person. So a similar narrative strategy is being employed over here. But Orwell saying that I'm a wiser man, an older man now, but at that point of time I did not know that the empire was dying. I did not know that the younger empires which would replace it would be much worse than the British Empire. All I knew was that I was stuck between two kinds of hatred: the hatred of the empire and the hatred of the Burmese people. And I hated them as well. Okay, so and again, look at the rhetoric over here. It's describing the Burmese people as evil-spirited little beasts. And again, this is just explicitly racist, right? And you're talking about human beings as beasts or animals, you're just being racist by default. However, what's interesting is that the racism is embedded in the essay. The racism is part of the rhetoric in the essay, and racism is part of the honest confession of the essay. So this is what I mean when I said that the political incorrectness of the essay makes it politically complex, makes it politically important and significant for us today. But he's not even trying to be politically correct. He's not even trying to give himself a good picture, a good image. So he's very much implicated in imperialism. So he's very much a part of imperialism, and despite the fact that he hates it ideologically, he retains the rhetoric of imperialism. So he's talking about the Burmese as evil-spirited little beasts who really make his job impossible, who hate him, and he hates them back in equal measure. So with one part of my mind, I thought of the British Raj as an unbreakable tyranny, something clamped down, in secularum, upon the will of prostrate peoples. With another part, I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts. Feelings like these are normal byproducts of imperialism. Ask any Anglo-Indian official if you can catch him off duty. So again, look at the extremity of his emotions. So he's thinking of the British Raj as an unbreakable tyranny, something which will go on forever, in secularum, for eternity. So it's a tyranny, it's a system of exploitation, a system of torture that the British are employing through their Raj, through their empire. So he understands it exactly as a torture mechanism, as an exploitative mechanism, a machinery for human exploitation. That's one. But equally and interestingly, he also thinks that Buddhist people are terrible, the Burmese people are terrible, and he wants to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts, into his belly, right? Again, very violent, very, very visceral kind of hatred, very visceral rage. And he retains the rhetoric of rage here as well. And then he comes to confess feelings like these are the byproducts of imperialism. So ambivalence like this, cynicism like this, violence like this are the byproducts of imperialism. If you stay in a system for too long, you end up being a cynical, violent person, full of extremity, full of hostility. And then he says, ask any Anglo-Indian official if you can catch him off duty. So, if you catch someone off duty, if you take the person away from the normative narrative of imperialism and ask the person what it really is all about, what do you really think about it? And Orwell says, in most occasions, you get this answer that I hate imperialism, it's a terrible thing. I understand it's exploitation at every levels, but at the same time, I hate the Burmese people as well. I want to beat them, I want to kill them, I want to drive bayonets into the guts. Right? So this sort of caught between, this feeling of being caught between, this state of being caught between two levels of hatred is what gives this essay a very, very claustrophobic quality. There's no escape from it. It's just stuck in hatred, stuck in cynicism, stuck in hypocrisy, and stuck in hollowness. Right? Okay. And then we move on. So this is the background, the discursive background of the essay that Orwell talks about. He says that, this is what I was, this is what I was like, this is what my life is like when I was in Burma, and this is the cultural condition in Burma. And my job as an officer, made me, do dirty things, made me an object of hatred. Everyone hated me, and I hated the empire, but then at the same time I hated the people back. Right? So what we see over here is how the hegemonic identity, the hegemonic male identity, the white male officer is the most powerful, dominant identity over here, how that becomes not just a site of privilege, but also a site of cynicism and hatred. Right? So that becomes not just a subject of privilege, but also the object of hatred and aversion, collective aversion. So this is the background Orwell sets up. So we'll stop here today. We conclude this lecture, and then the next lecture we'll see how the event in the essay, the elephant going mad and then shooting the elephant, how that event really opens up the constructed quality of power, privilege, and hatred, and how that really gives a very ambivalent and disturbing and unsettling glimpse of the ideology of imperialism, of the grammar of imperialism, of the codes and narrative of imperialism, and how that really makes the essay a really rich text to study if you're interested in serious culture studies today. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.